Laughter rippled through the summit ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, under the glow of crystal chandeliers and the soft clink of wine glasses. A lowly creature like her dares touch my crystal glass. The voice was low and sharp, delivered in Arabic. Its owner, Karim Al-Mansour, a billionaire from Doha, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smug smile curling as the guests around him burst into laughter. He was certain the American waitress didn't understand a word. Lena Whitmore bowed her head, her hand trembling slightly as she set down the glass. Her slender fingers tightened around the silver tray, cool and rigid. Her gaze lingered on the crystal stem, the one now tainted with scorn by the very man who had once signed the letter that changed her life. And yet, he didn't recognize her. 1 second. 2. Then Lena looked up, and in flawless, near-native Arabic, she spoke. The crystal glass does not lower the one who holds it. It only reflects the dignity of the one who drinks from it. The entire room froze. The laughter cut off mid-air, like something had been strangled. Karim stared, stunned. The wine in his hand trembled just slightly, its rich surface mirroring the crack forming in his composure. Lena Whitmore didn't belong here. Beneath the glowing chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel, in the heart of Manhattan, she was just a shadow moving silently between silk gowns and raw power, a ghost among tailored evening wear and the smug laughter of the elite. She wore a faded black uniform, a white ruffled apron wrinkled from too many washes. Her hair was tied back neatly, revealing a faint scar just above her left brow, a remnant of a childhood fall she never bothered to hide. To them, she was nothing more than the girl with the tray. But no one in that room knew that every step she took across the velvet carpet was a step carried by desperation, from towering medical bills to the slow fading breath of her mother back home. Rose Whitmore, the woman who had raised her since she was 3, was now lying in a small hospital bed in Columbus, Ohio. Time there moved like sand slipping through a glass too fast. Every extra shift Lena picked up, every dollar in tips, was another night her mother could breathe. Lena's childhood didn't start in a warm home. She had once been a nameless baby left at the doorstep of a church on a misty autumn morning, swaddled in a blanket stitched with the name Lena. That name would later be rewritten as Lena by the first man who lifted her into his arms, hands trembling, but heart resolute, Professor Yusuf Al-Hassan. Professor Al-Hassan was an Egyptian linguist, once a lecturer at Cairo University before moving to the U.S. He had no wife, no children, and lived alone in a tiny apartment overflowing with books. And Lena, barely 4 years old, became the center of that universe. While other children were learning to count with cookies or sing the alphabet in rainbow colors, Lena was tracing ancient poetry. If you want to understand someone, learn their language. If you want to love a culture, learn its poetry. That's what her adoptive father always said, every time he lit another candle on their worn wooden table. They couldn't afford electricity that winter, but Lena never felt poor. For the first 3 years of her adolescence, Lena lived in Cairo, where her father returned to care for his aging mother. She attended an international school by day, but her real education began at night, in a small flat that smelled of ink and old paper. She learned Arabic calligraphy by candlelight. Each stroke meant to breathe like it carried someone's soul. She recited the poetry of Al-Mutanabi, not for grades, but to feel why words written 1,000 years ago could still stop a heart. And most importantly, she learned the power of silence, the kind of silence that speaks more than language ever could. When Lena turned 16, Her father passed away from a sudden stroke. That was the first and last time she cried aloud. She returned to the States carrying not clothes, but handwritten manuscripts, a worn poetry volume, and the memory of a man who had never once called her an orphan. Tonight, in that grand ballroom, no one knew that the quiet waitress pouring their wine had once been the chosen student of a world-renowned professor. No one noticed her sharp gaze behind calm eyes, or the way she moved between gilded chairs with quiet dignity. They only saw her worn shoes, faded apron, and mistook her silence for weakness. They were wrong. Table 1, quietly nicknamed the Lion's Den by the hotel staff, was always reserved for those who didn't just hold power, but wore it like a crown. People who could hush a room with a chuckle and destroy reputations with a raised eyebrow. Tonight, at the center of that table sat Karim Al-Mansour, a billionaire from Qatar, one of the most influential investors in oil and tech across the Middle East and North America. 50 years old, broad-shouldered, sharply dressed in a deep charcoal Armani suit, every gesture he made seemed calculated for maximum observation. To his left sat his 22-year-old daughter, Layla Al-Mansour, an international relations student at Georgetown, recently back from a semester in Paris. She sat upright, eyes drifting across the room like she was memorizing every face. But every so often, her gaze dropped, quietly uncertain. Next to her was Victor Radley, media tycoon, slicked-back hair, thin glasses, and a Rolex that caught the chandelier light like a flashing signal. Brielle Langford, heiress of New York's famous Langford real estate dynasty, perched beside him like she'd just stepped out of a fashion editorial. Her pearl necklace layered so thick it looked ready to strangle her own voice. And at the far end, Senator Grant Holloway, seasoned Republican figurehead, red tie neatly pinned, with a smile that looked stapled on, and eyes always scanning for something to ridicule. Lena approached, balancing a tray on her left hand, setting down flutes of champagne with her right. She could feel their eyes, piercing, scanning, judging, like a full-body X-ray. "She's the waitress? I thought she was a freshman who got lost." Brielle tilted her head, speaking just loud enough for everyone to hear. She smirked, her gaze lingering on Lena's worn-out shoes. "She probably comes from some place where the nearest Starbucks is 3 hours away," Radley added with a throaty chuckle, eyes locked on the frayed collar of Lena's uniform. "Well, at least she balances the tray properly. That's training, probably from some second-rate trade school." Holloway said casually, then turned toward Karim with a sly look. Karim chuckled under his breath and replied in Arabic, "She carries that tray like she's lost in a street market. Doesn't even know where she is." The table erupted in laughter. Lena didn't flinch. She was used to laughter like this. Laughter laced with power, designed to make others shrink. Laughter that assumed silence equaled submission. She placed the last glass before Layla. The younger woman's hand trembled slightly, but she quickly covered it by clutching her napkin tighter. "I bet she's never even been in a place like this." "Look at the way she holds the glass," said a man in a velvet blazer, likely one of Radley's entourage, his voice nasal and smug. "She probably thinks this is the height of luxury," chimed in a woman wearing diamond earrings, tossing her head back with a laugh. Lena moved on, performing her duties, but every step she took seemed to echo with the taunting voices behind her. From the corner of the table, Layla glanced at her father, then followed Lena with her eyes. She looked like she wanted to speak, but her lips only pressed into a thin line. Something in that quiet girl, steady, cold, but unshaken, struck a strange chord in her. Familiar. Too familiar. Lena was pouring water for Senator Holloway when her hand trembled, spilling a few drops along the rim. "Careful now," Holloway quipped. "This glass costs more than your week's tips." He laughed heartily, slapping the table as if he'd just told the joke of the year. Laughter rang out again. Lena tightened her grip around the glass bottle. She inhaled slowly, tried to keep her breath even. And from somewhere deep in memory, she heard her father's voice from that cramped Cairo apartment years ago. "Language can be a sword, but sometimes, child, silence is enough to let others cut themselves." The kitchen door swung shut behind Lena, separating her from the perfume-laced air, the glint of crystal glassware, and the cruel laughter wrapped in luxury. In here, the heat clung to the walls. Oil hissed in deep fryers. Orders were shouted in half a dozen languages. Knives clattered on cutting boards. But somehow, she heard the soft ting of her phone in the pocket of her apron. She pulled it out and swiped the screen. A text. From Cousin Ellie in Ohio. "Insurance denied again. They said this case is beyond reasonable recovery. We're out of options, Lena. Sorry." Just 4 lines. But for Lena, they landed like stones dropped one by one into a well already bone dry. She froze in the middle of the cramped kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat. The noise around her seemed to blur, muffled under the weight pressing against her chest. No options left. The words echoed louder than anything else in the room. She slumped onto a metal stool by the sink, her back against the cool tile wall. Sweat soaked the back of her uniform. Her hands, still clutching the phone, trembled slightly. Her mother had been fighting for 2 years. Chemotherapy, radiation, experimental drugs, 3 hospital transfers, and Lena had fought with her. Night shifts at 3 restaurants, public assistance applications, crowdfunding campaigns. She'd even considered pawning her father's keepsake ring. And now, every door had slammed shut. She lowered her head, pressing her forehead against her hand, eyes clenched tight. Just a few seconds. That's all she allowed herself. Just a few seconds to not fall apart. The intercom crackled to life. "Whitmore, back to table 1. They're asking for another pour." Lena opened her eyes. She slid her phone back into her pocket and drew a long, deep breath, one so full it stretched her ribs until they hurt. She pulled out her hair clip, retied it tighter, dabbed her eyes with the back of her wrist. And then she stood up, back straight, apron still neat, footsteps steady. When Lena stepped back into the Summit ballroom, no one at the VIP table had any idea her world had just come undone in under a minute. They didn't see the redness in her eyes, didn't hear the breath she swallowed whole, didn't know that every step she took now wasn't for duty, but for dignity, for the pride her father had passed down in ink and syllables and candlelight. No tears, no trembling, no retreat. At the far end of the room, the light glinted off the marble walls like a calm lake beneath moonlight. And amid all the opulence, Lena stood like a pause, small, quiet, but impossible to erase. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the air had shifted. Those who were paying attention, like Layla, might have sensed it. A subtle undercurrent, silent but irreversible. And it was coming. Very soon. Lena returned to the VIP table, a glass water pitcher in hand. She no longer bowed her head. Not out of fear, but because she refused to give them any excuse to call her defiant. She began refilling glasses, starting with Senator Grant Holloway. As he accepted his glass, he chuckled and said with mock curiosity, "I wonder if she can even spell the word diplomat, or just tray and tips." The table erupted with laughter. "Or exit," Victor Radley added. raising his wine glass like he'd just made a toast. "Because I fear she'll be needing that soon." Lena remained calm, but in that instant her eyes flicked down to Holloway's hand, where a golden eagle ring clenched into a fist around the stem of his glass. She moved to pour for Layla. Her hand was steady, but when she reached Brielle Langford, a few drops of water spilled over the rim, trailing down the glass like a minor accident. But Karim Al-Mansour didn't let it go. He burst out laughing, louder than at any moment before. "Careful, girl. These crystal glasses aren't meant for dishwater." Another wave of laughter surged from table one. Guests at neighboring tables began glancing over, some laughing along, not wanting to feel left out. Lena set the pitcher back onto her tray, gave a polite nod, and stepped back. But this time, she didn't walk away. She stood still, hands gently clasped in front of her, eyes lowered, but not submissive. This was composure, not surrender. Layla noticed the shift. She started observing more closely. She noticed something wasn't right. Not with Lena, but with the atmosphere around her father. The eyes of the powerful men at the table, Radley, Holloway, Karim, were no longer just dismissive. They were amused, gleeful even. They were savoring each moment of Lena's humiliation, like it was the appetizer to a fine meal. And that unsettled her. It rattled something deep. A young man in a wine-red velvet jacket, hair slicked back like glass, piped up from the end of the table. "I bet she's never served anyone wearing a $10,000 suit before. Look at her holding that glass like it's a gas can." The laughter rang out again. A woman in emerald silk with bright red lipstick shook her head and added, "Those shoes! I swear my mother wears the same ones for gardening." Lena picked up her tray, preparing to walk away, but her eyes met Layla's for just a second. Something flashed. Not defiance, not pain. It was clarity. A quiet awareness of exactly where she stood, of what they thought, and of what was coming next. Layla released her napkin onto her lap. Her hands curled into fists, then opened again. Her expression remained composed, but in her eyes, something was stirring. It wasn't just discomfort. It was doubt. And it was directed at the man she had once admired most, her father. Meanwhile, Lena kept working. She placed the tray down at a side table and straightened a few glasses. Every movement measured, like it had been rehearsed with a ruler. No excess, no hesitation, no fear. A fellow server, Nora Hill, passed by her, looked like she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. There was something in Lena's posture now that no one dared to interrupt, not because she demanded attention, but because she was dangerous in her silence. The entire room seemed to be suspended between two breaths. Those around table one didn't yet realize they had pushed everything to the edge. And when it breaks, it won't come with noise. It will come with silence. And after that, every eye will turn. Another scoff came from Senator Holloway. Radley lifted his glass for a sip. Brielle leaned in to whisper something smug to the woman beside her. Lena remained where she was. Both hands rested gently on the satin-covered table. Her face was calm, the light from the chandelier above casting a soft amber glow across her hair. And then she lifted her head. The room stalled for just a moment. Her eyes locked on Karim Al-Mansour, the man who had mocked her most tonight, in a language he believed she couldn't understand. No one moved. And then Lena spoke, softly but firmly, quietly yet clearly, in flawless Arabic. "If you are arrogant, remember, he who carries light does not need to shout to be seen, and he who raises himself through lowly words will be drowned by silence." Her voice wasn't loud, but every syllable landed like a drumbeat. Each word deliberate, the rhythm shaped with the grace of someone who had studied the ancient pulse of classical Arabic poetry. No one at the table moved. Some didn't fully understand. But one man near the edge of the table suddenly exclaimed, "Al-Mutanabi!" It was Ambassador Evelyn Duval of France, distinguished in a modest suit with a golden wheat pin on his lapel. He leaned forward, eyes wide. She quoted him, word for word, and perfectly. Chairs shifted. Heads turned toward the ambassador, then back to Lena. Now, she had placed her right hand over her chest, right above her heart, just as her adoptive father had once taught her. "Every great poem begins from the heart," he used to say, "not the tongue." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, not from pain, but from memory. She gave a small bow, not deep, not exaggerated, just enough to say, "I don't need to shout to be heard. I don't need anger to be seen." A soft clink echoed, the sound of a spoon slipping into a teacup. A woman with red lipstick dropped her smile like a cracked mask. Brielle Langford blinked rapidly. Her back straightened, as if something had just shifted inside her. Victor Radley set his glass down, no longer so theatrically composed. A man who had been laughing only moments ago now removed his napkin from his collar, laid it across his lap, and glanced down at his wine like it held a question. "What exactly am I drinking to?" Karim Al-Mansour wasn't laughing anymore. His eyes blinked rapidly, as if someone had flashed a spotlight into his face. He opened his mouth, but only gripped his glass a little tighter. Layla, the only one who hadn't laughed all evening, now pressed her lips together, but the corners trembled slightly. Not from anger, but from something else entirely. A quiet, rising awe. In just a few seconds, Lena had tilted the gravity of the entire room. Not with power, not with threat, but with a single poem, spoken in the language of her humiliators. With such precision and grace, no one could deny its beauty. And when you cannot deny, you are forced to listen. At nearby tables, conversations began to quiet. It was as if the stillness around table one had rippled outward, like a hush across still water. No one wanted to be the first to speak next. Lena remained still. Her hand had lowered from her heart, and she resumed the posture of a server. But the way she stood, calm, upright, without effort, made several people reconsider how they saw her, even if only for a moment. A wave had just rolled across what once seemed like a still surface, and it had only just begun. The air around table one was still tense after the poetry recitation, but as the looks began to shift, from condescension to confusion, from confusion to silence, Karim Al-Mansour could no longer sit still. He leaned back in his chair and gave a dry, forced laugh, as if trying to break the atmosphere now tipping toward Lena. "Humph. Memorizing a few lines of poetry isn't that impressive. Arabic is a language that parrots can mimic. Quoting a poem doesn't mean she understands anything real." He turned to Radley, as if seeking backup. "Ask her something real. Something a parrot couldn't fake." Radley smirked and caught on instantly. He set his wineglass down. "Gladly." He leaned toward Lena, eyes gleaming like a predator who'd played this game before. "What's your take on the bilateral tariff adjustments between Qatar and the U.S. and their impact on crude oil import volumes, particularly after the cooperation agreement signed this past June?" He asked the entire question in Arabic, but not just any Arabic. It was fast, razor-sharp, and loaded with financial and geopolitical jargon that even native speakers would struggle to unpack. The table went quiet again. Some guests tilted their heads slightly, as if waiting for Lena to stumble. This was a trap, and everyone could see it. But Lena simply tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming with quiet focus. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't freeze. She simply listened. And then, in clear and composed Arabic, she responded. If we reference the May report from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, crude oil imports from Qatar rose by 11% compared to the previous quarter, largely due to adjustments in Article 3 of the new tax agreement. However, following the standard trade cycle models aligned with sliding exchange rates, that advantage will likely be offset next quarter due to the retroactive provisions imposed by the U.S. side. I'm afraid the optimism surrounding the June agreement was mostly symbolic. In reality, small and mid-sized enterprises in Qatar will suffer, especially as logistics costs increase, with the container rate hikes out of Dubai. Her words were sharp, each concept unpacked with accuracy and clarity. No fluff, no stammering. She didn't just answer the question, she reframed it, analyzed it, and exposed its weak assumptions, all with the fluency of someone who didn't just study policy. She understood it. The table went dead silent. Senator Grant Holloway was the first to break it. He began to clap. Slowly, but deliberately. Each clap deliberate, as if he had just witnessed something far more remarkable than a congressional hearing. Victor Radley sat up straighter. The smirk was gone. Brielle Langford looked down at her glass, avoiding Lena's eyes entirely. Guests at nearby tables started whispering. A man in a gray suit leaned toward his wife. She's not just fluent. She's political. A well-dressed older woman, likely a journalist, murmured, "That's the language of someone who's lived it. You can't fake that." Layla sat motionless. Her hands gripped the napkin in her lap. For the first time in her life, she had witnessed a woman, once mocked and belittled, completely shift the power dynamic, using only her mind. No shouting, no defense, no tricks, just knowledge, spoken in a voice that could not be dismissed. And Lena? Once she finished, she gave a small nod. No triumphant smile, no arrogance, no bitterness, just the quiet confidence of someone who'd long been underestimated. She bowed politely and turned back to her water pitcher, as if what had just happened was simply part of her shift. Nothing special. But everyone knew. The room had turned. Kareem's guttural laugh echoed through the banquet hall, ripping through the tension that had just begun to settle. "If you're really that brilliant," he sneered, "then why are you a waitress? Could no one else afford to hire you?" Lena didn't respond right away. Silently, she unfastened her apron, revealing a worn envelope tucked behind the fabric. A bright red seal, stamped with an eagle, and the words, "United Arab Emirates, Ministry of Foreign Affairs," glinted under the lights. She held the envelope high, then opened it and pulled out the folded paper inside. Her voice rang out, clear and steady. Honorary scholarship for the top student in the Middle East U.S. Exchange Program. Awarded to Lena Whitmore. Signed by Dr. Kareem Al-Mansour, Special Advisor for Cultural Diplomacy. The room fell silent. Kareem froze. His lips parted, but no words came out. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Layla looked at her father, confusion flooding her eyes. The light in the room seemed to dim, then swell gently again as Lena continued, "When I was 17, I wrote an essay about how language can serve as a bridge to peace, rather than a weapon of division. That essay was chosen to represent the youth of the United Arab Emirates in a global exchange initiative, and the one who selected it was you." She looked at Kareem, not with anger or resentment, only a quiet disappointment. The kind that stings deeper than fury. A memory returned, a warm, softly lit office in Abu Dhabi, 5 years ago. Karim, then still removed from political life, sat at his desk, poring over stacks of essays. He paused at one typed page, eyes focused. The words were simple, but filled with hope, written by a young girl who believed that the human voice could heal the wounds of war. He had smiled that day, picked up his pen, signed the lower corner of the page. And now he stood before that very same girl, without recognizing her, without remembering that he had once opened the first door to her future. The name Lena Whitmore now struck like a dagger into his pride. A journalist quietly lifted their camera. A videographer had already trained their lens on Lena. And in that breathless silence, the first applause came. From none other than Senator Holloway. Layla stared at her phone screen, her fingers frozen. The screen displayed a video, a clip from last year's International Translation Conference. It was Lena, standing behind a podium, confidently addressing a panel of experts from across the globe. Her voice calm, measured, but brimming with conviction. We translate not just words, but hopes, pain, identity. Every phrase we preserve is a fragment of someone's soul. And to strip a person of their voice is to erase their existence. The audience in the video had given her a standing ovation. Layla's throat tightened. She looked up from the screen, her gaze moving from her father's rigid figure to Lena, standing alone in the quiet aftershock of the revelation. Without a word, Layla stood up. Heels clicking softly on the marble floor, she walked toward Lena, past the rows of stunned guests, past her father whose face had gone pale. And then she did what no one expected. She wrapped her arms around Lena in a firm, sincere embrace. In a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, she whispered, "You may have forgotten, Dad, but I didn't." A collective gasp seemed to ripple across the room. Cameras clicked. Gasps turned to whispers, whispers into murmurs. Karim remained frozen, jaw clenched, fists trembling at his sides. Brielle, standing nearby, subtly lowered her head and began to quietly back away toward the far wall, trying to disappear from the spotlight. Victor Radley, who had once mockingly called Lena a linguistic charity case, cleared his throat awkwardly and stammered, I didn't know she was that Lena. Obviously, we were all misinformed." His attempt to save face fell flat, but Layla didn't care. Her arms were still around Lena. The two women now stood united, not just as acquaintances, but as a generation refusing to repeat the arrogance of those who came before them. And in the silence that followed, it became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just about a girl who once received a scholarship. It was about truth remembered, dignity reclaimed, and the courage to speak up, even when the whole room had gone quiet. A heavy silence hung in the air. Everyone seemed to need a moment to process what had just happened, and why it left such a lump in their throat. Then, from a table near the window, a distinguished man in a charcoal suit slowly rose to his feet and spoke. "She is the embodiment of dignity." His voice wasn't loud, but it echoed through the space with quiet authority. Heads began to nod. Then a few people stood, not to leave, but to applaud. A ripple of clapping spread across the room like a rising tide, and this time it wasn't for anyone else but Lena. Layla was still standing beside her, gripping Lena's hand tightly, her eyes filled with pride and emotion. Behind the scenes, a few technical staff members, who had been silently watching the entire event, quickly uploaded the video clip of Lena's response to social media. One caption read, "They thought she was just a waitress. Turns out, she was a living language." Within 10 minutes, The video had already been shared tens of thousands of times. On Twitter, the hashtag #SheTranslatedDignity began trending across the country. Clips resurfaced from Lena's keynote speech at last year's translation conference, particularly the moment where she had said, "Every language we preserve is a piece of someone's soul." The news spread faster than any speech delivered that night. Major outlets, which had initially planned to cover Karim al-Hassan's million-dollar gala, swiftly changed their headlines to "From Mocked to Magnificent, the Story of Lena." Meanwhile, Karim remained frozen at the head table. His face no longer bore anger, but emptiness. It was as if his soul had left his body the moment Layla whispered, "You forgot, but I didn't." He glanced around and, for the first time in his life, seemed to fully grasp something that power could never command: the loss of trust. Every gaze cast in his direction now felt a few degrees colder. Some people looked away. Others stared as though they were re-evaluating everything they had ever respected about him. Karim swallowed hard and slowly rose to his feet. His movements weighted, as if the full burden of the past had just collapsed onto his shoulders. No one stopped him. No one walked him to the door. The massive wooden doors at the back of the room closed with a dry click, like the final punctuation on an era built on pride. A week had passed since the gala, yet the ripples from that evening still echoed across the world. News outlets, social media pages, op-ed columns, everyone had something to say about the waitress, who silenced a room full of billionaires and diplomats. But Lena? She was right where she'd always been, at the Midtown Plaza Hotel, donning her dark green apron, tying her hair in a neat bun, and moving silently through the lobby. Only now, the stares she received weren't dismissive glances. They were curious, cautious, even respectful. Some employees straightened up when she walked past. Guests who had once ignored her now offered tight smiles, unsure if she would remember their faces or their silence. But Lena never brought it up. At the espresso bar, she wiped the counter clean as if nothing had changed. She adjusted the pastries, polished the silver tray, refilled the napkin holder. That's when a soft voice called her name. "Lena?" She turned around. Layla Al-Mansour stood there, not as the daughter of an oil magnate, but as a young woman holding something close to her chest. She looked hesitant. I've been meaning to give you this," she said, extending a small leather notebook. Lena hesitated before accepting it. She flipped it open. Inside were pages, lined with neat, handwritten sentences. Some were just a few words, others spanned paragraphs. All of them were apologies, from people at the gala. Some anonymous, some signed. "I collected them," Layla said, nervously tucking her hair behind her ear. They wanted to say sorry. For what they said. For what they didn't say." Lena's fingers brushed over a line. "I judged her without knowing her. That shame is mine to carry." She quietly closed the notebook, slipped it into her apron pocket, and simply smiled. "No need to say anything else," she replied. Layla blinked, surprised. "Really?" Lena nodded. "I've learned, sometimes silence says more than words." Layla exhaled, her shoulders softened, and for a brief moment, the noisy world around them faded into stillness. In that quiet, something passed between them: mutual respect, unspoken understanding, the kind that can't be demanded, only earned. From a waitress who once served invisible, to a woman the world could no longer ignore. Have you ever been looked down upon just because of who you are? Because of the color of your skin? Because of the job you do? Because of your voice, your past, or your choice to stay silent? Lena is you. Lena is all of us, the ones who've been overlooked as if we didn't exist. But sometimes, in that very silence, we find our loudest voice, not in shouting, not in harsh words, but in dignity, in eyes that don't bow, in the quiet strength to walk past those who once belittled us. Lena walks out of the Midtown Plaza Hotel. The early April breeze brushes past the trees. New York City hums with its usual noise, but for Lena, today feels different. Her hand lightly touches the envelope in her coat. A full scholarship in linguistics from Columbia University. She doesn't cry. She doesn't cheer. She just stands there on the crowded sidewalk and smiles. The city lights reflect in her glasses, sparkling like the thousands of words she never spoke out loud. Because now, she doesn't have to. The world has listened. Have you ever been a Lena in this world? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. True Tale Time, where the unheard are finally heard.